Hey there! Are you familiar with deployment slots in Azure App Services? If not, you might want to keep watching because in this video we'll show how deployment slots work and why they are really useful, so stay tuned. Welcome to Developer Ramp Up, a channel dedicated to anybody who wishes to become a software developer or a better software developer. In this video we'll talk about deployment slots in Azure App Services. This is a cool and powerful feature that Microsoft Azure App Services provides to make deployment smoother. It also enables testing in a 100% production-like environment and easy rollback if something doesn't work as expected. In this video we'll show how to create deployment slots, how to deploy an app to a deployment slot, and how to swap deployment slots. So let's get started using the Azure portal. That's my Azure portal where I already created a resource group that contains a few resources that I've prepared especially for this video. And what we have here is of course an Azure App Service, an App Service plan for billing and so on, and an application insights account that was created automatically when I have created the app service. For now, for us it is important only this dev ramp ds app service. So we'll click on it and we expect that a new blade will open and we see here the configuration of this app service. If we click on the host name, we should see a basic HTML file that comes by default with the creation of each Azure app service. That's okay. And of course we have other type of configuration and information that we can look up here. On the left side, if we scroll down a little bit, we see here this option deployment slots. And here is the place where we will add a little bit later a deployment slot. But before we go any further, I would like to add some credentials here, because we would need these credentials when we want to deploy a very basic HTML file to this app service deployment slot using FileZilla, an FTP client. So the user would be devramp. It's okay. Let's make also a password for it. Let's confirm the password and hopefully it matches. No, it doesn't, of course. Let's try again. And now it seems that everything is correct, and let's click on save. This should save our deployment credentials, which is very important. Let's go back to this app service and let's click on these deployment slots. Now we can simply click this add slot button, and adding a deployment slot is really not very complicated. We just have to give a name. Let's call it staging. And let's suppose that we will use this deployment slot as a staging environment for our application. Here we have for now two options to clone configuration, but we don't want to clone any existing configuration. This option might be useful when you have several deployment slots configured, maybe one for testing, one for staging, maybe one for other purposes, and so on. And in that case, there might be some configuration like database connection strings and so on that might be the same. So you can simply clone them when you create a new deployment slot. However, we don't really need to clone this configuration right now, so we will create a brand new deployment slot without cloning anything. And we'll have to wait a few seconds. It normally doesn't take very long until this new deployment slot is created. And in fact, yes, we see here this deployment slot. Now, before we go any further, I want to take a few minutes to talk about what deployment slots are. Now, normally we have the Azure App Service where we have our application that is running in a full production mode, let's say. So if somebody goes online and searches for our web application, it would find that URL and they would be able to access it. Now, in real life scenarios, as I like to call them, there's often the need to create different slots for the same application. For instance, we would need a place where we can deploy an application to be tested. We need a place for staging and so on. And for this purpose, Azure AppService created this feature of deployment slots. So we have our production environment that is up and running, but we can have several other slots depending on the pricing tier that we have, in which we can deploy another version of the same application, for instance. And the very cool thing is that if we click on this deployment slot, you would see that a new blade opens, and this deployment slot is basically an Azure web app itself. It has a different host name, so you can click on it and it should open another URL, and we should see the exact same HTML file, which is as expected. And the good thing is that you can use all the features that are there on web apps also on each deployment slot. And a very good example in this case is that you could connect your staging deployment slot, for instance, to a branch on Visual Studio Online or GitHub and so on. So your application might have the master branch which would represent the production application, but you might have a staging branch, and then you can connect the staging branch directly to this deployment slot, and every time you build that branch, a new version of this product is deployed to this deployment slot. And your production application is not affected at all. So you can now test this application in this deployment slot, check if everything is okay, you can perform whatever actions you want. And when you are ready, when you see, okay, this application is okay for deployment in production, you can simply swap deployment slots. And we'll see how that works a little bit later. For now, there is one thing that I would like to copy from here, which is the FTP deployment username, and let's copy it into a notepad. And I would also like to copy the FTP hostname. The reason is that I would like to connect with FileZilla in order to deploy a very basic HTML file that would act as our web application that is deployed to this staging deployment slot. So let's switch to FileZilla right now to make the connection. That's my FileZilla client, and I must admit I cheated a little bit because I have already configured my host and my username and the password so that we do not waste a lot of time. So just click on Quick Connect, and now we should connect to our staging environment. And this could be a little bit helpful because here we see exactly how we can deploy an application to an Azure AppService using FTP. So if we click on sites and on www root, you see here is this hosting HTML that comes by default when you create a new Azure AppService or Azure Web App, as we have in the case of the staging deployment slot. Here I already have some demos that I worked for previous videos, like the middleware. And if you didn't check our videos on middleware, please check them out. You might find a link in the description or a link here somewhere on the screen, and it might be really useful because we talk a lot on how middleware is supposed to work on ASP.NET Core. What I did, I prepared a release version and I have published it. And the published version is under netcore app and publish. And I use the command line to publish it, but we'll do a total different video on this topic. Good. So now we have here the www root from our deployment slot, and here we have all the files that were created during the publish process of this ASP.NET Core application. So let's just copy them over. And let's get rid of this hosting HTML file that comes by default. So now everything should be done. Now we can close the FTP client. Let's also make a quick refresh to our browser so that we refresh our Azure portal. And let's then check if we really managed to publish this API to this staging deployment slot. And here we have the host name. And if we click on it, it will take a few seconds, and as you can see, we have hello from middleware 1, middleware 2, and so on, because this is what we did in the middleware tutorial. So right now it worked. We know exactly that we have deployed our web application to an Azure App Services deployment slot, which has a total separate host name and so on. So this is fairly cool. Let's now close everything and let's go back to our app service and let's see exactly what happens or how we can swap these deployment slots. For now, as you can see, the app service, which is the production environment, let's say, has still this HTTP file. So let's close it for now and go back to deployment slots. And here, if you already have a deployment slot which is running, and this is our staging deployment slot, we can simply click here on swap. And this will start or will configure a swap process between these two deployment slots. Now for source, let's have staging, and as destination, let's have production, because the target, the destination should, or in our case, would be always the production environment. However, you can swap slots between different other slots. For instance, if you have a testing deployment slot, a staging deployment slot, and so on, you can also swap these two deployment slots. In this case, we swap with our production environments or with our, let's say, production web app. And just let's click on OK. And now a swapping process is triggered, which would take a few seconds. And afterwards, we should be able to check in our app service, so in our deployment or in our production application, if the slots were successfully interchanged. So I will be back when this swap ends. Now the process is completed. As we can see here in the notification area, swap operation completed successfully. So let's close this notification first, and let's close the entire notification window. And if we go on overview, this is once again still our dev ramp DS. So this is the production Azure App Services. And let's click on the host name on the URL. And as you can see right now, we have here the exact things that we had previously on the staging deployment slot. So these two deployment slots were successfully interchanged. But let us check if also on the other deployment slot, because the staging deployment slot should now contain what was previously the production deployment slot. So if we click here, we would expect right now to see that standard HTML page. And in fact, that is really the case. So we see that these two deployment slots, so the staging deployment slot and the production slot, were successfully interchanged. Now let's suppose, for instance, that we discover some problems in our production environment right now. This means that we can go here on this app service, and if we click on this URL or the host name, we still have this deployed or the swapped software version, let's say. So what we want to do is, because let's assume this is not performing as expected, we just want to roll back the changes. So we want to have everything like it was before we performed the swap. It's nothing easier than that. What we have to do is simply do a swap again, and it would be exactly the same swap. So from staging, because the old application that was previously in production, now it is in the staging deployment slot. And of course, we want to do that to move the old application again in production, because this is a version of the application that we know it works correctly. So let's just click OK. And once again, a new process is triggered, and these two slots would be interchanged again. If we wait a little bit, we would see that the swap process should complete successfully, since there are really not a lot of things that need to be interchanged. We have only a few files, and in fact in what was now staging, it was only one HTML file, and in what we have right now in production, because the swap is not completed yet, is or contains only few files that are not big at all. So let's wait a little bit to see exactly, see here, click here to access quick start. So this should be fine for now. Let's first of all, because we have closed this notification, let's click on this host name. And as we can see right now, we have once again in production what we had earlier. And this is that standard HTML file that comes with each Azure App Service. And if we go to the staging deployment slot, we would see that we should have once again the API that we have deployed earlier. And that's really the case. So we have now on staging what we previously had in production, on the production deployment slot. So the rollback has worked successfully, and now we are happy because our application is working again. Once again, I want to underline the importance of using deployment slots, because you can add several such deployment slots for different versions of the application, maybe for testing, for staging, or for any other reasons that you might want to deploy a different version of the application. And you can easily swap between these deployment slots, and if things don't go well, then you can at any time swap back and everything should be fine again. I really hope that you find this video useful. If you really do, feel free to subscribe to Developer Ramp Up. By doing this, you'll always be up to date with the newest content we create. A thumbs up would be also highly appreciated, because it will make this content easier to discover. Should you have any feedback, just hit me with a comment. Thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.